お待たせいたしました。それではプログラムを再開いたします。
Thank you for waiting. We will start session 3, which is Asia, a Green Energy Transition. The moderator is Mr. Teruyuki Ono, Executive Director, Renewable Energy Institute. Thank you. We will start session 3. For this revision, what is the impact of renewable energy? In session 1, we have looked at EU response and Repower EU is the plan to accelerate the activities. We were not able to talk about this, but also in the US there is the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act. They will make a major investment into the related investment. On the other hand, in Japan, as of February, Kishida administration has made a cabinet decision about the GX basic policy. Under this basic policy, it is true that for Japan, renewable energy will be promoted. Energy saving is also mentioned. So Japan is looking towards the same direction as the world. But at the same time, fossil fuel needs to be used. The importance of fossil is also emphasized. So whilst continuing the use of fossil fuel, Japan says that it will work on decarbonization. Under the GX basic policy, Japan's direction of decarbonization is mentioned, and Japan's policy will be exported to the global market, in particular exporting to Asia is mentioned. Asia Zero Emission Community is also mentioned. Just the other day, the first ASEC ministerial was organized. In Japan, of course, renewable is mentioned, energy saving is mentioned, but at the same time, what Japan has emphasized is that ammonia will be co-fired with fossil fuel, or Japan emphasizes CCS, that it will also be used in power generation and decarbonization of a thermal power plant. The method is CCS. These are some of the areas emphasized in the government of Japan's policy. Asia continues to be the engine of growth of the global economy, and a large amount of energy will be required. The energy required for the Asian growth, how to make it compatible with decarbonization, this is not a matter only for Asia, but for the entire global economy. And therefore today, we have 3 panelists from Southeast Asia, South Asia, which is India. We have experts who know about this region. So to introduce them, the panelists, Ms. Sarah Jane Ahmed. She is active with the V20 vulnerable group in the Philippines. She has been the analyst of the power sector. And beside her, Mr. Fabi Tumiwa. He is the executive director of Institute for Essential Services Reform in Indonesia. Joining online, I think from the US, a Global Energy Future Initiative Director, Climate Imperative Foundation, Dr. Kartika Sen, with the DOE and other organizations. He advises on energy policies of India and other areas. We have 3 international panelists. Also, we have Ms. Okubo, senior researcher of our institute. There are 4 panelists for this session. We have 70 minutes, so in the first half, I shall invite their initial comments. And the latter 35 minutes or so, hopefully, it will be interactive Q&A. So may I first invite Miss Okubo about the discussion in Japan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ono-san. My name is Okubo from REI. From my side, what is positioned within Japan's green transformation strategy? I would like to talk about Asia Zero Emission Community Initiative, and then I would like to raise issues for the discussion to follow. And there's a speech that was done in COP26 with respect to Asian zero emissions community. Well, since solar power plays a major role in the transition to renewables in Asia to help stabilize electrical frequency in the region, converting existing thermal power generations into zero emission power generation is necessary. And Japan, through Asia Energy Transition Initiative, will develop leading projects worth $100 million to transform fossil fuel-fired thermal power into zero-emission thermal power, such as ammonia and hydrogen. The model is Europe, EC. So within the community, to co-finance, to standardize technology, and to create Asian emissions market, and set rules led by Asia, not by the West, and to operate under the Asian rules. So what I would like to raise as an issue is development of zero-emission technology. What is it? So ammonia co-firing, CCS, as part of zero-emission thermal technology. That's what is referred to. And here in Asia, there seems to be focus on this, placing this at the core of the approach. So there are demonstration projects that have already begun. Malaysia, India, Indonesia, Thailand. So incumbents and some new operators funded partly by Japan are operating. And ammonia, hydrogen from a fossil fuel, and 2 trillion yen green innovation fund is partly used to build supply chains for ammonia and hydrogen. There are a number of problems with ammonia co-firing. One is that in the current ammonia production, because it uses natural gas as an ingredient, it emits around 1.6 ton of CO2 for every 1 ton of ammonia produced. So even 50% co-firing is achieved, it's not as good as gas-fired power. On the right-hand side, 2 years ago, this Asia initiative started in Japan. And Japan plans to provide as much as 30 to 40% of its electricity in 2050 with thermal power with CCS. But there are only 2 coal-fired power plants with CCS in the world that have been developed in the last 50 years. And therefore, IPSC is still saying that this is immature. And the problem here in Japan is that there's a lack of land for storage. And so the idea is to export CO2 emitted here in Japan to overseas. And for that purpose, Asia CCUS network is being operated. So emit CO2s in Japan exported to overseas to sequester that overseas, and Japan will get credits for that. 230 to 280 million tons of CO2 is expected to be exported outside of Japan. That's a quarter of Japan's current CO2 emissions. So why are we doing this? The Japanese government's understanding of Asia's energy situation is as follows. In Asia, renewable resources are unevenly distributed. There are lots of islands, so coverage of each grid is limited, and interconnections are limited. New coal-fired power stations have not yet been recouped or depreciated. Demand for electricity is increasing rapidly. So it's not realistic to try to use renewables to meet a large part of the increase in electricity demand. So zero-emission thermal power is absolutely necessary. And I would like to point out a few issues with respect to this. Listening to the government's council's discussions, there is limited renewable potential in Asia. And that is perhaps because the Japanese government is looking at IEA's SEP scenario. According to that, only 40% of renewables by 2050. But in the SES scenario close to the Paris Agreement, renewables are expected to be 85% of the capacity of 2050, not just solar, but wind to provide 44% of electricity, hydropower 26%, geothermal 16%. So there is potential. But in order to achieve energy transition, the question really is how to resolve institutional and regulatory framework issues and infrastructure development issues. Now, the other aspect is the timeline. The biggest achievement of COP26 conference held in 2021 was to clearly state that we're going to stay in line with 1.5 degrees Celsius target. There are many different scenarios toward 1.5 degrees Celsius, but as IPCC report made clear, longer the delay in taking measures up to 2030, greater the proportion that will have to rely on unknown technologies. So in response to this, COP recognized that measures up to 2030 are critically important. So this is IEA's 2050 net zero scenario. So in developed countries, all coal-fired power plants that are new without measures must stop, and all existing and new coal power plants will have to be phased out by 2030. So it seems that the understanding is off. So existing facilities and coal-fired technology that's to be newly developed must be looked at in balance, and I will skip the details, so please have a look at the materials later. So when Japan wants to provide support for Asia's decarbonization, with its own roadmap of continuing thermal power usage as well, into the 2040s, Japan taking leadership in supporting other Asian countries' roadmaps toward decarbonization is a concern. It will likely delay the overall decarbonization of Asia and place the region far behind the rest of the world. I would like to talk about interconnections. Lastly, according to the Japanese government, the coverage of each grid is limited in Asia, but there's an ongoing program called Asian Power Grid. So that is looking to strengthen regional interconnection lines and to promote multilateral power trading. Eventually, this is to connect all of ASEAN. So that's the idea of the initiative. In June last year, in 2022, Singapore purchased a cleaner energy from Laos. They purchased Laos hydropower via Thailand and Malaysia, and electricity is already being transmitted. And I think this is only the beginning of what to come. So by connecting wind power and solar power across national borders, that will lead to greater security of energy in Asia, I believe. And the business community is paying very close attention, keen attention to this. Well, Japan has contributed to individual renewable energy projects. So electrification at homes, making homes resilient, raising individual welfare. There's a lot of research testing to that. So coal-fired power, which supports economic growth, when that's replaced, what will be the impact on society? What will be its impact on economic growth? I think we need to come up with a more specific vision that should be the challenge that we should be addressing, and that is where support is required. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Okuba. According to the documents by METI, Asia is growing rapidly, so there is no other way but to continue to use fossil fuel. And at the COP28, the government pamphlet distributed mentions that Japan has no other way and has to be forced to use thermal power. It was a very strong language that it was inevitable that there was no other way but to use a thermal power plant. Now inviting Fabi, please, Mr. Fabi Tumia.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to speak in this event. My name is Fabi Tumiwa. I'm with a think tank in Indonesia called Institute for Essential Services Reform, and we've been working on energy and climate policy in Indonesia in the past 15 years. So my presentation is about Southeast Asia energy transition. I think to continue the previous speakers, and we would like to see what is actually opportunities and challenge ahead for Southeast Asia to be able to transition from fossil fuels. The study from IEA last year shows that with the current pathways of Southeast Asia in meeting the energy demand, so the energy demand can be double in the next 20 years. And with the current policies that rely on the fossil fuel, that could actually lead to the energy crisis in the Southeast Asia. So the IEA report is very, very clear that current energy policy is not ensure the energy security for the region. Why? Because we depend so much on the fossil fuels. And that's the reason why Southeast Asia has to transform its energy system, moving away from fossil fuel to the renewable energy. And I quoted a study by IRENA, Renewable Energy Outlook for Southeast Asia, that also published last year, that actually shows that Southeast Asia can transition from 90% of renewable share of final energy to 65% by 2050. And there is a number of key strategies to achieve this. The electrification of end use is important, and that's ranging from the electrifying transport, building, and industries, also using electric vehicles and electric cooking, and also to produce clean hydrogen. So this is very important strategy in the electrifying the demand side. At the same time, we have to build more renewable energy capacity at the supply side. So ASEAN can use, Southeast Asia can use different type of renewable energy, which very rich. Right now, most of the Southeast Asia has a plenty of solar. Some has a wind, as well as bioenergy, which currently untapped, which coming from agricultural waste, as well as bioenergy production from crops. So we have plenty of renewable energy. So there is actually a wrong assumption to say that we cannot fulfill our future energy demand with renewable, because Southeast Asia has a plenty of it. And the Southeast Asian nation have an aspirational target to reach 23% renewable energy of primary energy and 35% of renewable energy power capacity by 2025. So currently, the total renewable energy capacity share reached around 33%, and it actually boosted in the last 3 years by the high deployment of solar PV in a number of Southeast Asia countries. And also in COP26, Southeast Asia countries, including Indonesia, Singapore, Vietnam, signed global call to clean power transition, pledging to phase out coal plants before 2050. So this is kind of a very, very strong statement from the country. Well, right now, solar and wind capacity penetration is still low. However, the total, and we see that total variable renewable energy generation is just 5%, but will be 11% by 2030. That's from the updated electricity plan from a number of Southeast Asia utilities. And the plan is to add 50 gigawatt combined solar and wind capacity by 2030. That's today's plans, right? But in some countries, we see that the grid congestion, like in Vietnam, for instance, and the ability to manage or operate the grid with variable renewable energy generation, like in Indonesia, is actually hampers the acceleration of variable renewable energy adoption. So this is kind of physical constraint and the technical constraint that some utilities are facing. But I think if we can overcome this problem, we can see the higher renewable energy penetration very, very soon. And that's actually true, because in the last 2 years, we have seen that national utility in the Southeast Asia have updated their power plan, and to reflect the change in the economics of solar and wind power, as I mentioned, leading to 100% share of variable renewable energy, wind and solar, again by 2030. So Indonesia, for instance, where my country in 2019, wind and solar combined is less than 2 gigawatt, is around 1.8 gigawatt. But with the latest 10 years electricity development plan, the utility increased that more than 400% for solar. So from less than 1 giga to 4.6 giga by 2030. As also for the wind, it's a bit down, but I mean, overall there will be some update again as the new project coming in. And we also see that in Philippines, the solar target, solar plan is also upgraded, 85% more compared to 2 years, the previous plan, as well as in Vietnam, where solar and wind capacity is actually increased. So we see that this utility responds to the new situations of solar and wind economics. And this figure I took from NREL report. So it is actually based on 2018 CapEx number, which, but even with this number, which is still high, if you look at the assumption, there are more than 30.5 terawatt peak of solar project and more than 1.4 terawatt of wind projects with levelized cost of electricity below than USD $150 per megawatt hour, and that could be potentially developed in the Southeast Asia. But if we look at the current capex, for instance, the solar capex now in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, in Philippines, in Vietnam is actually below $1,000. So it's already declined around 40% than the 2018 figures. So it makes actually, in our projection, it could be double the size, like 60 terawatt that can be developed in the Southeast Asia. So even if we look at this number, we can power the region with solar and wind combined with the other renewable. 100% renewable by 2050 is something that very, very possible from a resource point of view. So, but in order to that, because the resources are scattered, right, and there is a different electricity consumption among ASEAN, Southeast Asia countries, so it's actually needed grid interconnection to bring the electricity to the load centers in the number of countries in the Southeast Asia. And in this case, we have seen that under ASEAN energy cooperation that has been that's entered the second stage in the grid interconnection. There's actually some new development which very interesting, where a number of countries has connected their grid. For instance, in the Indo-China, Thailand, Laos, Myanmar, they have connected the grid. Indonesia with Malaysia, and the plan is to increase the interconnection later on in the next 5 years. So with grid interconnection, and we can maximize the utilization of wind and solar potential, and reach energy transition compatible with 1.5 degrees as stipulated in Paris Agreement, with 90% renewables in the region. So what is actually the challenge? There is a couple of challenges. Of course, many of these countries are heavily rely on fossil fuel, coal, natural gas, and most of this country in Southeast Asia, electricity is being subsidized, and coal being subsidized, natural gas being subsidized, and this is very good for politicians. Yeah, it is because they can gain popularities, and of course that happens in a country like Indonesia. Last year, for instance, we spent more than $40 billion for energy subsidies. I think it's increased 4 times compared to the previous. Compared to previous. Also, in terms of coordinations among different government, different levels, national, subnational, between ministries with the different interests. I think we have seen that a lot in my country, but also true in some country, because every ministry, they have their own interests, they have own lobby. But also we see that the problem right now, as we can see from Vietnam, that they have to cut off much of the electricity from solar because the limitation of grid infrastructure. Building grid takes more time and it's more expensive. So rapid renewable energy capacity generation sometimes cannot be met with the grid expansion, and that create kind of problem like curtailment and others. So this is kind of the issue that we actually face, and because of that, utility are more careful in making ambitious plan to build renewable energy. Also, we see that a number of policy that hinder renewable energy development, such pricing policy in Indonesia. There is a domestic market obligation price for coal, which coal price is capped, that makes coal artificially cheap, and also natural gas. And we also see that in the last few years, and also that's the contribution from Japan actually, to over the technology that has not yet proven, right? It's like ammonia co-firing, CCUS, CCS, and lately US also promote the small modular reactors, that the thing that it hampers the ambition of the government as well as utility to transition to the renewable energy technology, which is more proven and cost effective. So this is number of challenge that Southeast Asia country are facing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fabi. Not only Indonesia, but across Southeast Asia, you have told us the overall situation. You mentioned that there is a potential with renewable resources, and positive actions have started, and you have introduced some examples in what area Japan can contribute. Thank you for your insight. And then, Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you to the Renewable Energy Institute for the invitation. I would now like to take the opportunity to introduce the Climate Vulnerable Forum and the Vulnerable Group of 20 Ministers of Finance. So the CVF, the Climate Vulnerable Forum, was founded in 2009 by 11 countries under the president of Mohammed Nasheed from the Maldives. In 2015, 2 months before the Paris Agreement, the V20 was established under the Philippine presidency to take climate action out of the climate negotiations. And this is actually even more important now because government colleagues in the V20, specifically the finance ministers, are feeling more and more how the publics they serve are losing faith in the multilateral agenda. And it is not only vital but urgent that changes are felt in the real economy. So the first 6 months of the V20 was very awkward for the finance ministers because they were unsure what to do with climate action. But they quickly realized how intrinsic it was to the entire development agenda, and today it is increasingly seen as central to the prosperity objectives of government. The membership now spans 58 developing countries representing 1.5 billion people, and from the map you can see that many of these countries have economic cooperation with Japan. I would now like to focus the presentation on maximizing renewable energy wealth and sharing the climate prosperity agenda of the V20, which includes key Asian countries. So 2022 showed clearly that volatility in international fossil fuel markets have an extremely destabilizing impact on energy security and economic growth. Maximizing renewable energy wealth can limit exposure to uncertain fuel prices. South Asia was arguably the hardest hit. And it's important to note that for Bangladesh, JICA plays a very important role in planning the power system. And so now, as they're redoing the plan, it's important to perhaps correct this unnecessary destabilizing impact. And on the next slide, we see that the efficient use of power and renewable energy brings cost competitiveness and has been an important job creator. But despite record-breaking deflationary prices of renewable energy and storage and innovations in storage and the future of green hydrogen, and despite the energy transition making economic and financial sense, we are still not on track to limit warming to the 1.5-degree safety limit, I guess, of the Paris Agreement. And over 350 million people across the CVF and V20 countries still lack access to energy. And if we take the entire South Asia and Southeast Asia, it's around 450 million people still lack access to energy. So the demand to remove fossil fuels from our economy is not just to safeguard the 1.5 Celsius limit of the Paris Agreement, it's also to counteract high prices and all the price instability and energy insecurity fossil fuels carry, obstructing growth opportunities. We cannot continue to tie the welfare of communities and opportunities for enterprises to an industry in terminal decline. And it's important to note that the numbers for ammonia and nuclear do not work for developing countries, and the analytical conversation on carbon capture hasn't even begun in Southeast Asia. So I'd now like to share the initiative by the climate vulnerable countries, the Climate Prosperity Plan. The intention is to build forward stronger by charting a decade of robust socioeconomic development that fully integrates renewable energy and grid modernization. And there are significant opportunities for major economies like Japan to strengthen economic partnerships in the form of climate-centered investment and trade, including technology transfer, innovative business model creation for a modernized energy economy that crowds in market participants and investors. And this is, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh have completed their climate prosperity plans, and this is all agreed on by the cabinet, so approved by the cabinet. And it has indicated investment opportunities of over $100 billion US, with a special focus on offshore wind and modernized grid connectivity for regional energy security across their borders. The climate prosperity plans, and if we just go to the next slide, I can show you that it's clear that offshore wind specifically can provide steady and reliable power generation. The Philippines as well is looking at offshore wind, but also geothermal energy, and they have recently removed foreign ownership restrictions on geothermal. So that means there's now new opportunity for international investors. This is just some of the outcomes of the climate prosperity plans where we see implications to real GDP and job opportunities. So the delivery of development positive climate action will require significant reform of the international financial architecture to drive new investment and industries to drive the new development, job, and growth prospects. What's interesting here is we see the energy bill as a share of GDP reduces as a positive impact of the energy transition. And so the Japan G7 presidency can make significant strides, especially for its neighbors in Asia. Japan trade and economic cooperation with additional investment space, including through transition finance, positioned for joint ventures and supporting the transformation of the industry, is an opportunity. Moreover, V20 countries are yet to build a lot of its infrastructure. And given that they are well below their fair share's carbon budget, there's an opportunity for advanced economies like Japan to invest for market returns and carbon credits. Moreover, with the view of trade and development, the current infrastructure base, as we see, is fossil fuels, and it carries a lot of risks. And this decade is the opportunity to course correct. And to open these options, there can be new economic cooperation and partnerships, and existing one can certainly be stepped up. For example, there is a need to expand exchange rate coverage facilities to give private sector confidence to develop modern renewable energy pipeline of projects in developing countries, because as it stands, and when it comes to developing green hydrogen opportunities, offshore wind and geothermal, this is where corporates with large balance sheets have the opportunity to have joint ventures and to reach the markets early so that they can build the long-term relationships and deliver the speed and scale of the investment and take advantage of the early returns that can be reaped from the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. The role of Japan as the presidency of G7, you have kindly mentioned. Indeed, Japan presides and India is the chair of G20. And from her climate imperative, Dr. Singh Karthikeya, if you can mention about the role of India as well as G20.
Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you all. I apologize that I'm not there in person. I will start my presentation here. Let's see if I can get, so, I think it's quite fitting to kind of be the last speaker here in terms of being able to share my thoughts on what's happening in terms of the energy transition more broadly. And I would spare you all, I think, all the data on India and its energy transition, because it is very much, the last time I spoke at this conference, I said India was in the eye of the energy transition storm. And I think that's very much still the case. The news that comes out of India in terms of what's happening, the strides it's making, is very hard to keep track of. And all of that's to say is that it's certainly something that I could spout a lot of data on, but there's plenty of information online. What I do want to harp on is how significant this particular year is in terms of shaping the energy transition agenda that we find ourselves in. We are very much in this tug of war of the energy transition. And by that, I mean, we have finally achieved a state where renewable energy investments have matched fossil fuel investments in the last year. And Asia is at the sort of forefront of being able to shape the agenda based on all the important geopolitical moments that are relevant for the energy sector this year. And they are, I mean, just to share in brief, the presidency of Japan in the G7, India, of course, having the G20 presidency, and capping it all off at the end of the year with the UAE having the COP28 presidency. I want to take a moment briefly to mention that while Japan, India, UAE are going to play host to these important geopolitical moments, that one of the major drivers of the energy transition agenda is certainly China. Not simply just driving the incredible growth in coal infrastructure domestically, but also really breathtaking investments in clean energy in the country. And of course, still playing an outsized role in financing energy infrastructure around the world, be it coal, gas, oil, or clean energy. So I think none of this is happening in a vacuum. I think all of it is being shaped by geopolitics, and economic factors are on everybody's mind. What I want to focus a little bit on is what it means to have Japan and India anchor these two important roles in the coming year, and what about their relationship in particular can not only drive the energy transition for these two countries collectively, but how it might shape the agenda more globally across the region and to the world. It is a very different, let me just start by saying it is a very different dynamic for a country like India to engage on climate action or energy transition with a country from the East, like Japan, versus a Western developed nation. I would argue that it comes with less historical political baggage. Japan is also more in India's immediate neighborhood, and by that I mean it's in Asia. And there are strong, long-standing shared defense and security strategy issues at play here. And it's only taken on more prominence since the idea of the Indo-Pacific was first introduced by Prime Minister Abe and then championed after that by the US government. In addition, I'd just like to point out that Japan has been an ardent supporter of large infrastructure assets in India for quite some time. In fact, I think if the figures are correct, JICA must be the largest investor in India's green energy transition. And that's important to note. But in addition, of course, there have been large-scale investments into India's urban infrastructure, metro systems, railways, and across the energy sector, be it green or not, there has been a relationship. So therefore, the alignment and cooperation on a shared vision of the energy future will have ripple effects across the continent. And again, I think this is made even more important this year, given the role that both countries are playing in shaping the global energy agenda. So just want to highlight a couple of areas that I think are important to keep in mind as we have this conversation of what matters to the two countries holding these presidencies in the coming year. I also want to just flag, that there are net zero targets in both countries. Japan's target is a couple of decades ahead of India's, though personally I think that the target in India will ultimately be realized sooner, given just the scope of opportunity for the green energy transition. And that the cooperation between the two countries is underpinned by a robust energy dialogue that has been in play since 2007. It's the forum to drive the conversation of what matters and what areas the two countries can collaborate in. And of course, there's collaboration on areas, touching CCUS and ammonia and, strategic petroleum reserves. But I want to highlight that the more promising areas for Japan-India cooperation are the ones that are focused on clean energy. And I think this is where, electric vehicles and energy storage systems, including batteries specifically, is a very important economic opportunity for firms in both countries to collaborate. I should just take a moment to say, just a few weeks back, India had this sizable discovery of lithium resources identified by the Geological Survey of India, and I think that presents an opportunity for investments from Japan. My colleagues have mentioned the role of green hydrogen as an interest to both countries. And I think here it can really be effectively used for steel decarbonization, which matters so much to the economies of both countries, and is a real potential bright spot for future collaboration. The other piece to share is the emergent offshore wind sector. And I know that Japan kind of led in the wind sector development decades ago and now is perhaps lagging, but there's an opportunity to partner with India on its nascent offshore wind industry and collectively build up its own offshore wind industry. And then, of course, there's important roles still to cooperate in energy efficiency in buildings and industries and solar energy. But I want to say that this is an incredible opportunity for companies in the two countries to gain an edge in a competitive global market, which is where I think the sort of strategic thinking is in both countries in terms of what will matter for future economies. And I think in the case of India, there's a real transition opportunity, particularly for state-owned enterprises that provide job security and contribute significantly to India's economy. So by state-owned enterprises, of course, in a place like India, I'm talking about India's national oil company, Indian Oil, who might be tasked with jumpstarting India, has already been tasked with jumpstarting India's green hydrogen production, or the development of offshore wind platforms, or a large company like Coal India, which is the largest coal miner on the planet, which might become a significant driver of India's renewable energy value chain, everything from mining critical minerals to manufacturing the ingots and wafers that go into solar panels as they're thinking about diversifying their business value chain. And this will be, again, an opportunity for Indian firms to court partnership from Japan's major firms. I want to just highlight briefly an exchange. I want to share with you all an exchange that I had once with an official from the Indian Ministry of Power. This is when I was at the Department of Energy, and we were agenda setting on what the US-India energy dialogue might look like. And he was just comparing, the difference between US-India energy dialogue and the US-Japan energy cooperation they had going on at the time. And he wasn't saying one was better than the other, but he was highlighting how, when the India-Japan energy dialogue happened, it included a strong component of B2B, business-to-business cooperation. There would be a plane full of executives coming with the officials to not just talk about policy priorities, but also to think about the sort of market opportunities of engaging with India on its energy transition journey. I want to conclude by sharing what this relationship means in a global context, because it's not happening just, between the two of them. They are trying to shape the global energy transition agenda, and that's what this session is about. And so energy security, I think, is a major driving factor for both countries. For Japan in particular, with oil and gas imports and coal imports, it's quite energy insecure in that sense. For India, on the fossil fuels stand, the oil and gas imports are quite high. It's trying to electrify as much as it can and substitute. I think that's the direction of travel for the government of India and its agencies that it's tasked for the energy transition. It does have significant reserves of coal, but I think what we're learning is that coal is probably not providing the same energy security as one might think, despite having such large reserves. And that's for a variety of reasons. So, when you're not having to extract and transport and burn, and the value chain of that is instead substituted by a fuel stock that is without those complications, the complications that come with all of that processing, it becomes an easier opportunity for long-term stability and security and affordability. But I also want to highlight that there are alliances that both countries are trying to champion, right? We've seen that with the International Solar Alliance that India started a while back, the One Sun, One World, One Grid initiative, which borrows actually what's happening in its neighborhood. And we heard my colleagues talk about the super grid or the interconnections at play in Southeast Asia. I think the idea is that if we can connect multiple grids across South and Southeast Asia, that will really benefit the cheapest electron flowing to where it needs to, and ideally it will be a green electron. And of course, I'd want to give a nod to the Asia Energy Transition Initiative, with the government of Japan has been championing, and now India is invited to partake in. So these are the ways in which the alliances in which they are, that they have formed and are trying to invite each other to, are shaping and influencing the direction of travel of the energy transition for Asia more broadly. Going back a little bit to the security regimes that are also in the region, which India and Japan are in. The Quad, has critical minerals cooperation. There's a clean hydrogen partnership as part of the Quad as well that includes Australia and the United States. I think those are important in the green hydrogen development agenda of both countries. Recently, we saw a meeting of the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum in which both countries are participant, I believe, to the Clean Pillar, which has many of the same components. And then the final one, which I think is a really interesting dynamic to watch this year in particular, is the exchange and dialogue between the International Partners Group, which includes Japan, and has been leading the conversation on just energy transition packages for countries like South Africa, and more recently for Indonesia and Vietnam in Asia, whether or not that will yield any fruitful discussions of what a just energy transition partnership could look like with India, if at all. And I would argue that in the case of India, I don't think India as one country can have a just energy transition partnership. It would have to be something that is specific to India's states, because they are quite large economically and in their population and in their in shaping their own independent energy agendas. Or additionally, it could be potentially for state-owned enterprises that are very linked to the fossil fuel value chain, but could really be transformed as drivers of India's economic growth, yet doing so in a climate-aligned manner. So that, I would say, these are the factors that, from my perspective, are important to keep in mind in terms of what matters when these two countries holding these two important positions in this coming year are going to have in terms of exerting influence on shaping the energy agenda.
Thank
you very much, Dr. Kaotkia Shin. We have some 20 minutes or so. I will focus on one topic. At the initial remarks, I mentioned that the government of Japan, METI, says that Asia has no other way, fatalism, that they simply have to continue to use fossil fuels, or that they have to continue to use thermal power plant or fossil fuel. But we have now heard comments that this area has abundant renewable resources. It's not only about tackling climate warming. As Fabi discussed, continuing dependence on fossil fuel will, in fact, cause future energy crisis. Sarah discussed that in the developing economies, another major issue is about people who still do not have access to power. So the role of renewable is large. So I will suggest just one topic for the discussion. As was mentioned, in Asia or in Southeast Asia, in South Asia, what role can Japan play? What cooperation could be done? When thinking about this matter, if possible, as Dr. Kaotkia Shin mentioned, South Korea is not on the panel, but China, after all, will play a big role, and I agree with that. In the past, just like Japan, until recently, just like Japan, China was a big player in terms of exporting a coal thermal power plant. So we can also keep in mind about the big presence of China, about China's role in Southeast Asia, South Asia. If you do have any comments about the role of China, that is welcome. But at the same time, I would like to suggest that we discuss about the role that Japan could play. May we first invite Fabi. In the past, there were past success cases of Japan's cooperation. If you can discuss about what you expect of Japan, please.
Thank you. Just to add to that, I think today, well, to shape the energy transition strategy and pathways for Asia, as well as Southeast Asia. I mean, through a number of cooperation. Last 2 years ago, Japan launched Asia Energy Transition Initiative that promised 10 billion financing for renewable energy, energy efficiency, and LNG, which also today, last week, there was a big meeting as well here when some of the country came in, including the minister from Indonesia, which also signed a number of cooperations on well, mostly on producing blue hydrogen as well as utilization of CCS, CCUS for the coal plant that supposedly retired. So this is today reality. But if you look in the past, I would like to recall Japan works on promoting renewable energy back in the 80s. I think in a number of Southeast Asia countries, including in Indonesia. 80s, I think Japan is very active promoting a solar, which I myself visit a number of projects funded by NEDO in the 90s for rural electrification, solar pumping system that during during the time that solar PV is still infant and very, very expensive. But Japan goes and went there and then invest in this technology and support Southeast Asia countries to acquire this technology. Also in the 90s, continue and in the 2000, continue with energy efficiency in industry, in buildings, promoting waste, the use of waste heat in the industry to reduce the dependency from, actually to reduce oil consumption in industry. So I mean, we see that a lot of the activities in technical assistance and support from Japan to a number of Southeast Asia countries, in Indonesia, I think, Thailand, Philippines, are very much related with the energy transitions today, right? But that happened 2 decades ago, right? It's too early, but now shifting to the others, promote nuclear, CCS, CCUS. So I think there is an opportunity if the Japan leadership would like to promote back to this technology. And right now, I think we have seen there is a strong interest also among Japan business. In the last few months, the couple of Japanese institutions, Mitsui, Sumitomo, even Japan Gas, came to our office and asked about what is actually we would like to invest in renewable energy, right? And can you tell me what is the prospective market of solar in Indonesia? So they are looking of this information because they want to invest. So with that, I can conclude that there is a strong interest among Japanese investors, banks, and industry to promote renewable energy and energy efficiency. But at the same time, there is a quite different approach from the leadership in doing this. So I think that's, hope it will change.
Thank you very much. You mentioned about the 1980s and 1990s about solar or improving energy efficiency, that Japan has played a role, and that there is expectation that this kind of effort will continue. Sarah, if you have an expectation about exchanges, cooperation with Japan, please.
ご質問ありがとうございます。
on the grid as we bring up potential of China. So China is one of the biggest grid developers in the world and investors. And for the Philippines, as an example, they pretty much run the main grid. But what's interesting now is last year, Japan's JERA, J-E-R-A, invested in the second largest utility company in the Philippines. And a large conglomerate in the Philippines and Kawasaki Heavy Industries also just inked a joint venture for new renewable energy in ASEAN, Japan, and Australia. So this is all quite interesting in terms of cooperation. And the reason I mentioned that is moving forward and looking to this G7 presidency of Japan, there's a lot more economic partnerships that can be built that goes beyond the usual gas, say LNG, partnerships that we see or that we saw prior to the pandemic. And so I think moving forward, the prosperity initiative of the vulnerable countries, Japan can be a key partner, key investor, as well as key technology provider, especially as Japan builds out their potential, offshore wind manufacturing base or other. So definitely something to look forward to, and perhaps something we can work on together.
はい、ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much, Dr. Kartikeya-sen. You already mentioned about the role of the presidencies of G20 and the G7. Going forward, if you can advise Japan what Japan might do, what do you think is important, please?
Yeah, thank you. I highlighted some of the areas of joint cooperation, but I will take note from something that Fabi mentioned about the image of Japan in India, right? It's a steadfast partner in India's development. Its approach in India has been very proactive, pro-growth for India's economy. One of the classic examples is the joint venture between Suzuki Corporation and Maruti, an Indian brand, and helping create a new automotive firm. And I think we must look back to that example from, I think before I was born, maybe, to what the future might look like. We've got a large market that has been electrified. Every last home now has electricity access. The next phase of what is a market opportunity for any firm that chooses to participate, any bilateral or multilateral cooperation opportunity is really to really build upon this electrification success and to make sure that it's done in a clean way, because that will be the most affordable way. I didn't dive deep into it, but electricity access and the politics of electricity is quite complex in India. And to shed the political constraints in which the utilities have been operating for decades, the best way to do it is to make sure that the fuel stocks are the cheapest, and it just so happens that they are trending clean, and they will only trend cleaner, because India has demonstrated that the cheapest electron is the greenest electron through its reverse auctions and PPAs for utility scale clean energy. So I think the biggest opportunity here is for Japanese firms and the government of Japan to really partner truly and embrace in a way that it's already directing, right, its agencies like JICA to invest in India's clean energy, but also for the firms that were leading prior and can still lead in clean energy technologies, the kind of which, there's a tremendous market opportunity to engage jointly with Indian firms. So I think that's the message that needs to sort of echo between what we're seeing in the G7 and what India will be projecting for the G20.
ありがとうございます。日本との
Thank you about the cooperation with Japan. Thank you for the insights and the comment. And the remaining few minutes, once again, I would like to refocus on the interconnection, cross-border interconnection. Fabi and Dr. Kartikeya-san also mentioned, but there's not much discussion inside Japan when it comes to solar or wind or energy efficiency. There is some discussion about specific discussion also about ammonia co-firing, but about cross-border interconnection. I wonder if Japan has a role to play. Not much discussion in Japan. Ms. Okubo, you briefly mentioned at the end of your initial comment. Can you come back to this point? And I would like to invite the international panelists about what role Japan might play for cross-border interconnection, please.
Yes. Earlier, I talked about the ASEAN power grid. So between the two countries, interconnections will be installed, and beyond that, interconnections will be extended to multiple countries overall. So step by step, the work is proceeding. As I said in my presentation, already renewables are being sent over across national borders. Singapore was seeking cleaner energy, and Singapore is already purchasing from Laos. Already such a business case exists. And in order for this to expand, efforts are being made. And as I read the reports, what I realized is that India is also looking to extend grids to neighboring countries, and assuming that they are to reach ASEAN eventually. So ASEAN is one thing, but interconnections in the continent, if we consider that, I think we can come up with a completely different type of grid and networks.
Thank you very much. In the different order, Dr. Kartikeyan about the cross-border interconnection. Not exactly Japan and India, there's too much distance, but about cross-border interconnection, I wonder if Japan might play a possible role, please.
Yeah, that's true. When I was thinking about the interconnections, there's a huge distance. There's many countries in play, and I must admit, I need to revisit what the interconnection possibilities are between Japan and Southeast Asia. I mean, this is the difficulty, right? Transmission lines are some of the most important electricity infrastructure, yet they have been some of the hardest to finance and to get permits to get built. And now we're talking about various different jurisdictions that need to come together and align on them. And I think what we're starting to see happen, South Asia has historically been one of the least integrated regions in the world in terms of various different types of infrastructure. And there's been concerted investments by different bilateral development agencies to help the integration of South Asian infrastructure, roads, rails, and electricity infrastructure. So there's one initiative by USAID that's been active for some time, and I think it's trying to establish interconnection in the region, and the idea is that it would then connect to ASEAN and onward. And I think having more discussions and driving more investment into the cross-border electricity transmission networks and undersea cables and things will be critical to driving this agenda. And I think India wants to hold that leadership role by championing the One Sun, One World, One Grid, Global Green Grids initiative. So if Japan wants to engage, I think it's got a ready partner to do so that's trying to uplift this platform.
Thank you very much. Fabi?
For the interconnections, as you know, Southeast Asia has this plan, ASEAN Power Grid, which the idea has been around since 90s, I think. But things getting serious now in the last 10 years, in particular in the last 5 years, because it's also driven by the understanding that Southeast Asia has the plenty of renewable energy resources. But if you look at the potential of solar and now and wind and the technology and also hydro, and the technology now become more competitive than fossil fuel. So there is a big interest of this country now to utilize the renewable energy. Right? But we also see that the different development of Southeast Asia. I mean, we look at countries like Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, that the electricity consumption is still low. The electricity access is below 70% compared to countries like Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, Philippines, that the economic growth is higher, and also the electricity consumption is also higher. So the ideas of utilizing this renewable energy potentials to share with the neighbor is there. What is not actually that we need to increase is actually the investment into this renewable energy, right? And now that's, I think, the challenge for Southeast Asia. And that's where I think not in the interconnection itself, but Japan can actually help to invest in this, in this project, renewable energy generation in a number of Southeast Asia countries to enable the green electricity to be carried from this country to the other countries. While building the infrastructure of the interconnection, I think it will take some time. But for sure, we can still develop. And also, now as renewable become cheap and there is a need for green hydrogen, for instance, to decarbonize our industry, these resources also can be utilized to produce green hydrogen. And there is another vision of ASEAN to build ASEAN power gas, that in the past it's for fossil gas. But you can imagine that this infrastructure, if can be built, also can be used to transport green hydrogens, right? So we see that there is a number of a project that actually require big investment, and I think that's the role of Japan in this case, not in the interconnection, but investment to make that interconnection happen.
Thank you very much. Sarah, you briefly mentioned, do you have any additional comments, please?
So on interconnection, an example is South Asia is quite regionally connected. I think Sri Lanka is probably one of the links that needs to come through, but there's interest from their government. So interconnection certainly for regional security, regional energy security is in play. Something for Japan perhaps to take into consideration as an idea is because Japan has invested already in some utility companies, in grid companies, it could be that if there is an opportunity for interconnection between countries, Japan could perhaps invest in both utility companies and support brokering that engagement. And so they could enable regional energy security this way.
Thank you very much. There must have been other areas that we would have liked to discuss, but we spoke about Asia, in particular Southeast Asia and South Asia. In terms of potential, there is a huge potential of renewables, and there are actions that have been initiated in order to accelerate the activities. Investment in the renewable per se is required. At the same time, there are scattered different types of resources. How to combine the use across the region, so in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and ultimately across the world, how could be a better interconnection, investment opportunity, business opportunities have been envisioned. Therefore, what role could Japan play in Asia? Profound insights have been provided. This is an important topic. Of course, we have not exhausted all the discussions at our institute. We will continue to discuss what role we can play in energy transition in Asia. We wish to continue the discussion, and therefore I would like to continue the dialogue with you. This will be the conclusion of the session. We express our gratitude to our panelists and a special thank you to Dr. Kautkia Sin. Thank you very much to the panelists. There will be a break. We will resume from 4:20. Behind the door in the foyer, drinks are available. Please help yourselves. Thank you.